They're just destroying money. A government budget surplus destroys money. That's what it does, pure and simple. And if the economy isn't going to contract, then money's going to have to be created somewhere else. And when it's created in the private sector, it's created in the private sector by households or businesses going further into debt. The monetary system isn't going to go away. And if you want to plan for and execute a major transformation in how we go about organising economic activity to make it ecologically sustainable, then you've got to understand macroeconomics and finance.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, Dr. Stephen Hale, talking about the importance of understanding the way modern money works in order to advocate for urgent progressive change. If you're new to MMT, please listen to our early episodes, but if you want to dive in here, I've linked to Stephen's article, What is Modern Monetary Theory?, in the show notes. It's a 5-minute read, and it's the quickest way to get up to speed I've seen so far. A key insight of MMT is that currency issuing governments, by definition, create new money every time they spend. This is true in Australia, the US, the UK, Japan, and Canada, to name a few. So, for governments like this, political arguments about affordability of programs in money terms are unnecessary. Governments like this can never run out of money. Instead, the question becomes, can we afford our policy proposals in terms of real things? Do we have the materials and labour to build that hospital? Do we have the materials and labour to build those solar panels? If so, a currency issuing government, by definition, can afford them. An MMT understanding of the way money works is vital for advancing progressive policy proposals. And in particular, and most urgently, when it comes to transitioning our economies into ones that sustain our ecosystem while leaving no worker behind, otherwise known as a just transition or a Green New Deal. So to that end, Dr. Stephen Hale has put together an event featuring possibly the world's most qualified thinkers on this challenge in a bid to reach key policymakers with urgent and practical solutions to the climate crisis. Learning how the money system works in reality and attending the Sustainable Prosperity Conference in Adelaide in January 2020 are a golden opportunity to further that aim. So I'll get out of the way and let Stephen Hale tell us about the conference. Thanks for listening. Dr. Stephen Hale, welcome back to the MMT Podcast. Great to have you.
Oh, thanks very much for asking me again, Christian.
So first of all, I really wanted to talk about the Sustainable Prosperity Conference that's happening in Adelaide in 2020, January 2020. For the listener, the website is mmt-adelaide-2020.com. We'll link to it in the show notes. But you got a lot of exciting guests, and I don't know, what would you like to say about it first off?
I would like to say that this is the best conference I'm ever going to organise, mainly because it's the only conference I'm ever going to organise. There's not a lot of highly paid professionals behind the conference that we're holding in Adelaide in January. Instead, it's basically two of us in our spare time with no money. So I've done a lot of it, but there's one person that's done even more than me, whose name is Gabrielle Bond, who has a part-time job as an organizer for a campaign group. But she's put in, I don't know how many hundreds of hours of work for nothing for this conference, for no reason other than wanting to make a positive difference. The motivation for running it in the first place goes back probably a year and a half now, maybe even 2 years, when I had the opportunity of nominating for an honorary visiting professorship, a non-Australian economist, and I nominated Professor Stephanie Kelton, who I guess that many of your listeners will be familiar with, and the university, I'm delighted to say, accepted the nomination. So she is our visiting Harcourt professor. A Harcourt professorship is named after a famous post-Keynesian professor, Geoffrey Harcourt, who's in his late 80s now, but split his career between being, for a while, the head of school in the University of Adelaide in the School of Economics, and being at Cambridge University and working with Joan Robinson and a whole bunch of other people who were from the generation before him, but had been the colleagues and students of Keynes. So we have that link back to Keynes. Geoffrey will be in Adelaide for the conference, and Stephanie is going to be at the conference because I've put the conference the weekend before her Harcourt lecture, the big lecture that she's going to be giving for the university. There were so many people in Australia that wanted to talk to Stephanie, and she's not here for that long, and it's a very big country, Australia. It's bigger than Europe. So if we'd gone around all over the place, taking Stephanie to where people wanted to speak to her, she just would have been exhausted, and it would have been impossible. So in the end, I decided to ask them to come to Adelaide, and initially I was just going to have a small conference, but it's just grown and grown and grown, and we now have not only Stephanie but Bill Mitchell and a whole bunch of other MMT economists, and also some of the world's leading ecological economists too, including a gentleman called Robert Costanza, who has the same status amongst ecological economists really that Randy Ray or Bill Mitchell would have amongst MMT economists. So we're delighted to have him coming, and there's all sorts of other people as well. I'm going to have some First Nations speakers, and I've got some trade unionists, and basically a whole group of experts who are able to share with us what they know about climate change and the potential to move very rapidly towards renewables and lots of issues like that. We're going to talk about the Green New Deal. We're going to talk about the New Deal part of that, which is about moving towards a more just, more equal economy, and we're also going to talk about the green part of it as well, which is really, really important in Australia, which is the world's leading coal exporter and the OECD country with the highest carbon dioxide emissions per capita of anyone anywhere in the world. We're better to talk about these kind of issues.
Great. And I see you've got Bill Mitchell and Warren Mosley kicking things off on the Friday there. It's Friday lunchtime it starts, just after lunch.
Well, Warren's not going to be here in person.
Right.
I did see Warren 2 or 3 weeks ago. He spends November, or a lot of November, visiting Bill Mitchell.
Right.
And I went to Sydney for the weekend at the end of November, and listened to Bill talking about his just transitions framework that he's developing, that he's going to talk a lot more about at our conference, and Warren was there in the audience. And what I asked Warren and Bill to do was just to sit down while Warren was staying with Bill and have a yarn about MMT and where MMT came from and all that. And Bill is going to play part of that video in the conference during the first of his 2 talks, and then we'll make the whole video available to people. But Warren won't be here in person. We also have a videoed interview, which I was the producer of, but it seems to have worked out all right anyway, which Phil Lorne has done with Herman Daly, And some of your listeners might have heard of Herman Daly, along with B.F. Schumacher and a couple of other economists back in the 1960s and 70s.
Schumacher wrote Small is Beautiful.
Yeah, he lived opposite my school.
Wow.
He wrote so bizarrely, I had no idea who he was at the time, but as a small boy, I knew E.F. Schumacher. But anyway, Herman Daly is one of 3 or 4 people who were the first economists really to discuss ecological sustainability properly. And he's the one amongst them that's still with us. And Phil Lorne interviewed him last week, and we'll use that video as part of the conference as well. But neither Herman Daly or Warren Mosler, much though we'd love to have them, will actually be in Adelaide. Everybody else will be here that's on the schedule.
Well, it's their ideas that we're after anyway. So, so speaking of that, this is a big question, but in your opinion, where does MMT intersect with green politics, the politics of sustainability, if you will?
Oh, that's a big question. If we go back a few years, I for a long time quite frustrated that the ecological economists that I spoke to didn't seem to have a firm grasp of macroeconomics or how the monetary system worked, and sometimes didn't seem all that interested. And of course it's important because the monetary system isn't going to go away. And if you want to plan for and execute a major transformation in how we go about organising economic activity to make it ecologically sustainable, then you've got to understand macroeconomics and finance. So that has been frustrating over a number of years, more so for my very close friend Phil Lorne and me, because I'm an MMT economist with an interest in ecological economics. Phil, well, I wouldn't say he's an ecological economist with an interest in MMT. He knows MMT very well, but Phil is primarily and initially an ecological economist himself, who's been trying to bridge the gap between ecological economics and modern monetary theory for probably 20 years, actually, in Phil's case. I've also, in the past, occasionally expressed a disappointment with modern monetary theory conferences, and I couldn't say this about the recent one in New York, but to an extent previously, where MMT economists have sometimes talked as though growth in real GDP, growth in gross domestic product is an end in itself. And it's not. It's a means to an end. And where I think, with certain exceptions, and Bill is one of them, but I think sometimes modern monetary theory economists in the past have not paid enough attention to ecological sustainability and those kind of issues. So one of the motivations for having this conference is to bring MMT economists and ecological economists and others together, because I think quite a lot of the time they've been talking past each other.
Yes.
I don't think that there's any contradiction between being a modern monetary, well, of course there isn't, a modern monetary theory economist. That's just about getting macroeconomics and the monetary system right, and being an ecological economist, which is just about recognizing that the economy is there to meet the current and future needs of people, and people are part of the natural environment. We have to operate within our ecological constraints in the future, although we're not doing so at the moment, but we have to rapidly move towards doing so. Otherwise, the well-being of obviously the present generation, but even more so future generations are going to be compromised. So one of the issues that I'd like to address, which I'm not going to talk very much about economics during the conference. I'm going to be running around all over the place, and I always say I'm an economics teacher. I'm not a research academic, so I'm not setting myself as an expert on all the things we're going to be talking about in the conference, but I have managed to bring to Adelaide, if they all turn up, a whole bunch of people that I think of as experts. But at the beginning, I'm going to say, let's just take real GDP off the table. Ecological economists talk a lot about degrowth. Not all of them, but some of them use the term degrowth a lot. Sometimes they talk about steady state economics as well. Now, I'm okay with steady state economics because we have to operate in the future within the precepts of, is that the right word, of sustainability that ecological economists have quite rightly outlined time and time again. We can't emit wastes at a rate which is above the rate that the natural environment can safely absorb them.
Right.
We can't use renewable resources at a rate which is above the rate at which they can be renewed. You know, we can't. If we do that, we're going to run out of fish stocks, etc. And we can't use non-renewable resources more quickly than we can develop renewable substitutes for them. There is a limit to the scale, at the physical scale, at which economic activity can take place, given a particular level of technology, without going beyond those ecological limits and causing our natural environment to continue to deteriorate over time, and we have to live within those limits. Now, I accept that entirely. The word degrowth I don't find all that useful.
Right.
Because degrowth of what? There are some things that we need to grow. We need to grow our ability to generate green, renewable energy. We want to grow the living standards of people at the moment who, in our very inequitable societies, don't have high enough and secure enough standard of living and the life opportunities that we would like them to have. We'd like to grow the quality and availability of all sorts of public services. There are other things we want to degrow, of course. We want to degrow the things that contribute towards our still out of control carbon emissions. We want to stop the intensity of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere increasing, and we need to do that very quickly. And eventually we need to bring that intensity down again. So there are things we need to degrow. There are things we need to grow. As far as gross domestic product is concerned, it's not purely a measure of scale. I'm going to go into that, how gross domestic product is measured at the moment, and all the arbitrary decisions which have been taken down the years about what's included and what's not included. But it's not a simple measure of the physical scale of economic activity. So it is possible to imagine that we could live within our ecological constraints in the future, and GDP might increase. For example, the way real GDP is measured, if the quantity of goods and services that we produced and the range of goods and services we produced was actually to stay the same, but the quality of those goods and services was to increase over time, then real GDP would increase, the way we measure real GDP. So it's not a pure measure of scale in any case. On the other hand, looking at it from an MMT perspective, we have in the past occasionally suggested, as mainstream economists nearly always suggest, that growth in GDP is an end in itself, and of course it isn't. As I said, it's a means to an end. If we have equitable full employment, if people are living good and secure lives, then if real GDP doesn't grow, it's not really a big issue. As far as I'm concerned. Actually, in the early stages of moving towards a sustainable economy, we need to make the sort of huge investments in renewables, in changing our transportation system and in other things, which means that it's almost inevitable initially that real GDP will grow, and indeed will grow faster than it has been doing in recent years. And also we're going to eat into our remaining carbon budget in the short term in order to allow ourselves to live within that carbon budget later on. But we do need a plan in order to bring this about, in order for there to be the sort of just transition. That's what Bill Mitchell will call it. He doesn't like the term Green New Deal or Green New Deal. That's what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez calls it, to ensure that we have this just and sustainable economy in the future. But I don't think talking about growth for the sake of growth makes sense. And I don't think the word degrowth is necessarily all that helpful. So, as I said, I'd like to do what I think Kate Raworth, another ecological economist, has recommended we do, which is just to take real GDP off the table.
Yeah. It's too blunt an instrument, in short, isn't it? It doesn't tell us enough about what it contains. It doesn't tell us, like you say, it doesn't tell us anything about the quality of production. Am I right? It's
not a measure of real of well-being in the first place. One of the things we do at the conference, and I might have mentioned this before, is Phil Lawn.
Yes.
Is going to unveil some new work that he's been doing on developing something called the Genuine Progress Indicator, which the way he's measuring it draws on about 15 economic and social and ecological indicators to come up with one figure, which you can see as an estimate of the net benefit of economic activity to human well-being. He's developing these statistics on a comparable basis for as many countries around the world as he can. He's basically given up his job and his income security for this, because doing this kind of work, which is something that he ought to be famous for one day, but doing this kind of work is not something which these days, at least in Australia, is a great career move. But that's what he spends his time doing. And one of the things I'm going to do at the conference is give him a platform, and we'll be putting him in front of some influential people. And what we'd like is following the announcements recently about Iceland concentrating more on well-being rather than on growth for the sake of growth. And not all that long ago, the Prime Minister of New Zealand said something similar. Well, we need an internationally comparable indicator, because politicians around the world, if you're going to say to them, don't aim to maximise real GDP anymore, if you do that, you're maximising something which, if you have a whole series of oil tankers running aground and enormous amount of pollution you have to clear up, that increases real GDP. It doesn't make people any better off, I should say. Far from it. And it wouldn't increase the Genuine Progress Indicator either. I'll let Phil at the conference, and he's done it online, but it'll do it better at the conference, and we will be recording his talk there, explain what the genuine progress indicator is all about. If you want to grow something, if you want to talk about growing something over time, if we could get politicians to aim to grow the genuine progress indicator, the way that Phil and before him people like Herman Daly have defined it, then we would be encouraging politicians to introduce policies which, by their very nature, would promote social justice and ecological sustainability and address climate change.
So with the GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator, I'm going to track down where Phil is describing it online and put it in the show notes, so we'll get it from the horse's mouth there. But if you're comfortable, is there anything off the top of your head that you could say are the measures within the GPI? Within what sort of things are we looking at there when we measure genuine progress?
At the moment, there is no standard comparable approach to the genuine progress indicator. So when you look at different studies done in different places around the world, some of them might have about 25 statistics combined to produce the GPI. Phil's internationally comparable one, because of the difficulties of getting comparable data in lots of different countries around the world, we'll have, as I said, about 15. Some of them are economic. So it starts with consumer spending. So consumption does contribute to people's well-being. There are costs, of course, associated with the consumer goods and services that we use, but they're dealt with separately within the GPI. He then adjusts consumer spending using an approach which I won't try and explain now, but for inequality. So the more equal is the distribution of income in a country, the better, as far as the genuine progress indicator is concerned. Even in mainstream economics, that makes sense. They talk about something called the law of diminishing marginal utility. The basic idea of that is that the more you're consuming already, the less you benefit from consuming an additional pound's worth of goods and services. Then investment in productive capacity for the future. That's a plus in the genuine progress indicator as well. And there are other economic statistics in there too, which Philip would talk about. As far as social statistics, unemployment and underemployment are in there, but other statistics that might be included in a GPI statistic is things like the crime rate and issues to do with mental health. I couldn't tell you now from memory which ones are included in Phil's measure. As I said, it depends on what's available in terms of things that are internationally comparable. You have to decide what you're going to include, you have to decide how you're going to value it, and then you have to decide how you weight it. And then as far as the ecological indicators are concerned, of course, carbon dioxide emissions go in there, but also things like changes in land use, so the loss of forest, loss of wetlands, and what other ecological indicators can I remember it's included in the genuine progress indicator? There are other ones as well. Okay. Basically, you've got those three groups of indicators. You've got economic ones, you've got social ones, and you've got ecological ones. You have to decide for each of them, because the GPI, so that in a sense you can compare it to GDP, it is calculated in dollar terms, or in the UK in pound terms. So you have to decide, and obviously there is a degree of subjectivity in this, but there's always some good reason for the decisions which have been taken. You have to decide which indicators you're going to have to include, and then you have to decide how you're going to value them, and then you combine them all together into one big statistic, which you call the genuine progress indicator. And when people say, when Phil or somebody else presents their work on this statistic, oh, I don't like the way you've done that, or I think you should do it differently, or you should collect a different set of statistics. And the answer to that is that this is just the initial attempt. This is not the end of history. So if you don't like the way the statistics are being put together at the moment, go and collect better statistics. What we're calling out for around the world is for national statistical agencies to do this properly. But one underemployed individual in South Australia who's doing this more or less on his own doesn't have the resources of the Australian Bureau of Statistics or the Bureau of Economic Analysis or the Office of National Statistics.
We should we'll link to his website then. I mean, surely he's got a Patreon or something where, you know, we're looking for an eccentric millionaire right now. Right.
Well, he does have a sponsor who's helping him out a bit.
Good.
But he has made, as you often have to do if you want to do this kind of thing, he's made a big sacrifice in trying to develop this and really devoted his life to it. And I feel a bit guilty talking about it, really, because especially this time of the evening, there's lots about it that I've just got crowded out of my memory.
Oh no, I think we've got
to listen to.
We've got a good we've got a good sort of overview of it there, and then people can look Phil up in the meantime. And hopefully I'll get to talk to him. Maybe you can put us in touch, Steve, and I'll get to talk to him for the podcast.
Absolutely.
You know, if he's got
absolutely.
time.
Oh, I'm sure he has. He's difficult to track down because he does use social media, but I can certainly put you in touch with him. He'd be delighted to come on. I'm sure.
And there's a great interview with you and him and Steve Grumbine on Real Progressives as well. So we'll also link to that.
Absolutely. You'll notice, I think people did notice when we did that interview that although we spend a lot of time in each other's company, we don't sound exactly the same when we talk about these things. Phil is towards the ecological economics end. I'm a little bit towards the MMT end, I suppose, on a continuum. Yeah. Where Phil would be more comfortable with that word degrowth than me.
Right, yeah.
So we don't agree on absolutely everything, but that's partly the point of this conference. The first day, we're going to start off with an introduction to modern monetary theory, which until I knew Bill Mitchell was coming, I thought, oh my God, I'll have to do that. But since Bill is coming, obviously I'm not going to do it. Talk about taking coals to Newcastle. So Bill will do that. Then once he's done that, we'll have some First Nation speakers talking about what we have to learn from Indigenous peoples in terms of custodianship of our natural environment. After that, we'll have Phil introducing people to ecological economics, because if there are, for example, people who've had a mainstream economics training there in the audience, they'll know no more about ecological economics than they do about MMT. And his interview with Herman Daly will come then. Then I'm going to finish the first day by having my dear friend Claire Connolly, the journalist, interview Stephanie.
Great, yeah, she's done great work.
Yeah, the second day it's going to be, at least at the beginning of the day, it's going to be about the New Deal part of a Green New Deal, where we're talking about the kind of future for Australia and for other countries around the world that we'd actually like to create. But then in the afternoon, Bill is going to be on again, and he is going to unveil for the first time a coalition of interest groups and campaigning groups that he's put together as part of his Just Transitions framework campaign, I suppose we might say, that he's going to start talking about, I believe, around Australia in the next few months, but he's going to do it for the first time at the conference in Adelaide in January. And then we'll finish the second day with what I was just talking about. Phil is going to talk about the Genuine Progress Indicator, explain how it all works. No doubt he'll talk a little bit about the deficiencies of GDP as a policy variable while he's doing that, and unveil some really interesting statistics about different countries that he's been working on for a long time. Then the third day, we'll start off with Robert Costanza, who I mentioned before. He's, let's say, the Bill Mitchell of ecological economics. He works at ANU, which is our leading university in Australia. He's going to be talking about the importance of maintaining our natural capital. So in some ways, similar to what Tyson Younger-Porter, one of our First Nations speakers, will be speaking about on the first day of the conference. Then we've got an expert talking about climate change and renewable energy. Then later on, we'll have a panel of trade unionists, including one of the most prominent trade union leaders in Australia, talking about workers, unions and climate change. And then we'll finish off the conference with Stephanie's big MMT talk.
Oh, this just sounds like heaven.
Hopefully, yeah, and hopefully I'll manage to press all the right buttons and record everything nicely. Otherwise, I'm going to look like a complete idiot. But yes, that's the idea. There'll be other bit. I haven't said everything that's going to go on across the 3 days. We've got all sorts of interesting speakers, some of whom I'm going to get to interview as part of the conference. And we're going to have a friend of mine called David Olney, who is a blind political academic who does a great podcast series himself that I sometimes share, and I've been on his show a couple of times. It's called Blind Insights.
Oh,
he's going to do short interviews with all the speakers as well. We'll set up a studio.
Is it fair to say we should just at this point say if anybody is in your region or can get there and they've got skills to volunteer, they should get in touch, right?
Oh, absolutely. But they should come anyway. I mean,
yes, of course, yeah.
Loads of volunteers. We can always do with more volunteers.
Great.
But at the moment, we've got about 200 people coming for this conference.
Wow. But
I want so many people that our media cannot possibly ignore what's happening. Mm-hmm. I want so many people. I know that some of the economic advisors of some of our leading politicians are coming. I want them to be impressed. For them to be impressed, I don't just need great speakers like Stephanie and Belle at the front of the room. I need lots of people in the room. So if there's anybody that can come, I've had one person get in touch with me and say, quite a reasonable thing for them to say, given the amount of emissions we're responsible for when we fly, that he can't come because of carbon emissions. I think just for even if you don't normally travel by plane, just for this conference, it might be worth doing, because ever since I had the opportunity to nominate Stephanie for the Harcourt Professorship, I've seen this as the one time when I would have just a small chance of shifting the narrative in this country. That's what I'm trying to do. Through the university, we're trying to get Stephanie onto mainstream TV.
So we need bodies.
Absolutely. Just come. You don't need to volunteer. Just come and support us. As I said, we've got 200, which is 100 more than anybody thought. But I can fit 400 in that room.
You need organisers. You need carnival barkers, right?
I have one organiser. I have the absolutely astonishingly great Gabrielle Bond. who is an absolute legend. In case she listens to this and haven't called her a legend, please leave this in the podcast. I will make sure she listens to it.
Yeah.
To be perfectly honest, at this stage, all I need is, well, I've got enough people in a way, but more people come and join the conversation and come on a journey with us. It's an unusual conference in the sense that everything's going to happen in terms of the presentations in one lecture theatre, because I want to take people on a journey, and there's no step in this journey. What I try to do is to design a conference that I would want to attend.
Perfect.
And then have a narrative so that it makes sense. We're starting off with Bill Mitchell explaining how MMT works. We're finishing up with Stephanie Kelton explaining how MMT transforms your vision of what it's possible to do. And there's lots of steps on the journey in between those two as well. That's what I'm hoping for in an ideal world. And I have never been so tired in my life as I am at the moment, trying to make it all work. So hopefully it will.
Well, we're so grateful for your time anyway. So look, before you fall in a heap, I thought, what better way for you to relax than for you to answer some technical questions to do with money?
Economics questions are easy compared to deciding who to schedule when and all those kind of things.
Okay, all right. Yeah, there's no egos involved here. It's just the fact.
Oh, I'm not saying there's any egos involved.
Okay, all right.
No, either. Yeah.
I'm sure. So look, by the time this podcast comes out, there'll have been an election here in the UK, and we'll have seen and continue to see one side deficit scolding and debt scolding the other side. Oh, you ran up the debt. No, you did. Who's been more irresponsible? That's literally happening now. Even as popular as MMT has gotten, as much as it's moved the needle, we're still, I see people who are ideologically aligned with me, using the whole, well, the Tories, say they're going to be responsible, but they run up the debt, and using that as a line of attack. Now, and obviously over there in Australia, you've got a surplus fetishist in charge, as far as I understand it. So can you say why this is just a completely wrong line of attack for both sides, and why it would set teeth on edge of anyone who understands the way the money system works?
Yes, I can. It does involve me going back over right to the very beginnings of what I might have said to you the first time we ever spoke, really, which is the three essential principles, what I think of as the three essential principles of modern monetary theory. The first of which is that every government and every society faces real and ecological constraints in terms of what we can produce with our available labour and skills and capital equipment and technology and natural resources, and for that matter, what we can produce without destroying our natural environment. There are limits there to the quantity of goods and services which can be produced given the current state of technology. We're not saying that MMT very definitely does not say that governments can spend without limit, without coming up against those constraints. And obviously, if you spend too much, given the productive capacity of the economy, then you're going to create inflationary pressures. Modern monetary theory, far from ignoring those inflationary pressures, concentrates on them more than other approaches to thinking about macroeconomics, because we address the fact that it's those real constraints which create the potential for inflation risk from any spending, whether it's by the government or the private sector. So that is the first principle. There are real constraints which every society faces. The second principle, if you are a monetary sovereign government, which means you are a currency issuer and you collect taxes in the currency that you issue and you don't have a fixed exchange rate, you're not on a gold standard, you don't have any significant foreign currency denominated debt, you have no purely financial constraints. Indeed, when you spend more than you collect in taxes and other receipts, when you run a deficit, then it's conventional to say that you are increasing the government's debt, and people can say that if they like. But given that you are the currency issuer, you have no need to issue government bonds at all. You can choose to do so for a variety of reasons we've discussed before, but you have no absolute need to do so. You could just net spend. And people can talk about the government debt increasing, but I don't even like to use the word debt. The British government doesn't really have a debt if we're talking about the consequence of it having run deficits in the past, so its financial liabilities denominated in pounds, because it's the currency issuer. How can you have a debt denominated in something which you issue yourself?
Yeah.
So that's the second principle. First principle, every society faces real constraints. The second principle, monetary sovereign governments face no purely financial constraints. And then the third one, which is the one that you were talking about really, is that sectoral balances always have to add up to zero, or to put it another way, for every net borrower in the financial system, there's a net lender, or put it another way, deficits and surpluses have to cancel out. What that means is that if we are talking about a country which does not have a significant and persistent trade surplus over time, then in order for the private sector to run a financial surplus and to increase the amount of net financial assets it holds, or to put it another way, in order for the private sector overall to move towards more and more secure balance sheets and less fragile financial system, it's essential for the government to run a deficit, because the private sector's surplus is the public sector's deficit. And so the responsible thing for monetary sovereign governments to do is to run as large a fiscal deficit as you can over time without coming up against those real and ecological constraints and causing inflationary pressures, in order to allow the private sector to net save in your currency and have stronger balance sheets and a more secure financial system. If the government tries to run a surplus, if the government has a surplus fetish, as the Australian government did at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s, as the US government did in the late 1990s, as the British government has done in the past, for example, under Margaret Thatcher and briefly under Tony Blair too, then if the government's going to run a surplus, unless you have a trade surplus as a country, that means the private sector is going to have to run a deficit if the economy is not going to go into recession. And that, over time, leads to the ratio of private sector debt to GDP increasing. It means that more and more balance sheets within the private sector become more and more fragile, move towards being what Hyman Minsky called Ponzi balance sheets, and helps to move you towards a financial crisis. At some point, you have a more fragile financial system as time goes by. So far from government budget surpluses leading to a more stable and secure monetary system, it's the precise opposite. As long as they are not inflationary, government budget deficits lead to a more stable and secure financial system, because government budget deficits effectively they increase the net money supply available to the private sector, which the private sector can hold as a financial asset without having a financial liability, without having a debt that it has to repay. So that's completely the other way around. The way we see the government budget in that sense is completely the other way around to how mainstream economics sees it. And we've been proved to be right time and time again over the last 2 or 3 decades. And now the chickens are coming home to roost, because in countries like Australia, there are very high levels of household debt as a consequence of governments in the past either running surpluses or running deficits which were not big enough to support the economy without the private sector going further into debt. And despite the fact that interest rates have been cut and cut again and cut again, and our interest rates now are just as low as yours. The cash rate in Australia now is 0.75%, same as the bank rate in the UK. So we've got the lowest level of interest rates that there's ever been in Australia. And it is still the case that consumer spending is slowing, the economy is slowing, unemployment's expected to rise next year, we may move into recession. And of course, if that happens, then the Australian government with its budget surplus, well, they're not going to end up with a surplus anyway. They're going to end up with a deficit in any case, because if you have a recession, your tax receipts crash, welfare payments increase, and the government budget automatically moves towards a deficit when that happens anyway. So you've got a choice, really, between running a deficit by design in order to support economic activity and allow yourself to build the kind of society that you want to build without it riding on the back of household debt, without it being dependent on an increasingly fragile financial system, or having a surplus fetish and driving the economy either into recession when the private sector is not prepared to do the borrowing that is necessary to support the economy, given that the government's trying to run a surplus, or driving the private sector further and further into debt so that you eventually have a GFC or something like it.
Right, yeah. So we should just hammer that point home. When the government runs a surplus, just in case you're new here, when a government runs a surplus, by definition, that means they are taxing more than they spend. So you can imagine that, you know, there's more money being taken out of the economy than is being put in. So just to tie that off.
They're just destroying money.
Yeah.
A government budget surplus destroys money. That's what it does, pure and simple. And if the economy isn't going to contract, then money's going to have to be created somewhere else. And when it's created in the private sector, it's created in the private sector by households or businesses going further into debt.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.